Hi class, this narrated lecture is going to cover chapter 1 in your public health nutrition book. And you might be wondering why we have a public health nutrition book when the class focus really is on non-communicable disease. And so first of all, we have to understand the difference between communicable and non-communicable. Communicable means that we can catch it, we can give it to someone. So this is HIV, this is the flu. Non-communicable means you can't catch it. So obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, all non-communicable disease derives from the way we live. So what is the primary thing when it comes to looking at non-communicable disease? It's nutrition, and the significance of nutrition is really vast. We'll spend a lot of time talking about hypokinetic diseases and nutrition. We'll see they all go hand in hand. For this class, we're going to look a little bit at the categories in order to understand what nutrition is, but we're primarily going to focus on nutritional concerns and behavioral concerns. Malnutrition is not going to be a primary focus for us because malnutrition, from your textbook sense, really looks at poverty, really looks at developing nations. We will focus a little bit on that. But our primary is really going to look at positive effects of health and nutrition and looking at what nutrient deficiencies and chronic disease look like as the result of overnutrition. So the problem is we have huge barriers, and you know you have huge barriers. Everyone knows that eating McDonald's is bad for you, and yet we do it anyway. So why? I also teach nutrition, and one of the first things I always say to my students is, you guys actually already know what's healthy. I don't have a magic secret. But when we're talking from a public health standpoint, we really have to say, what are those barriers? If everyone knows that bacon, cheeseburger, and fries isn't good for you every day, yet 75% of Americans eat that every day, then what's not working about the way we're either communicating, how we're approaching it? Is our message accurate? And so really in this class, we're going to look at barriers to proper nutrition. We're going to study them from a gender aspect, from an equity aspect, and looking at different populations around the world and how developing nations can develop healthy diets. And we're going to look at the types of programs that would be in the realm of public health. So primarily, we focus on education programs, assistant programs, and look at the inequality between poverty and gender, and that can also be cultural as well. So what is public health nutrition? Well, there's not really a best definition. And so what I am going to do is present you with this definition. I'm not going to read this to you. Please go back and read it, but I want to talk about its pieces a little bit because I think it'll help bring kind of the public health aspect of non-communicable disease to life. So let's look at the science and the art. Why is it science? Because we are talking about a science. This is not someone's opinion. This is not someone who needs to sell something. The diet industry in the United States is $1 billion industry, and most of it is not true because people want it to be easy, and it's not. So public health can't take that stance. We have to talk about the science. The recommendations have to be scientifically founded. We will talk about nutritional epidemiology in this course. You guys are going to learn about research done in nutrition and how we can actually really study populations. And so, but when we do science, there's always an art to science because not everything is known and not everything has been done. And we have to continue to kind of artistically open our minds and see what haven't we visualized yet? In addition, what makes public health interesting is it's science-based, particularly, but we have to take other things into consideration that are not always quantifiable, like cultural factors, like social structures, right? And so we have to be able to marry these to fully understand how do we best serve the public. One of the primary things you do is help prevent disease. As you know, and as we see, healthcare costs are exorbitant. And I'm giving kind of U.S. examples, but there are places that there's no access to healthcare. It doesn't help the population to just treat the disease. We have to have aspects that treat, but what we really need to be doing is preventing. We need to have policy and avenues so people don't ever get sick versus, well, now you have cardiovascular disease and you're 45 years old. The majority of your life quality is not going to be awesome. And so how do we do this in public health? We look at consumption of adequate nutrients, right? Which is really interesting because even though developed nations have an abundance of calories, quality nutrients is not necessarily a part of our diet. And we'll talk more about that as we get into this semester. But we got to look at consumptions of the right amounts of foods, not exceeding the energy needs that we have, meaning your body needs a certain amount of energy to function every day, given how much muscle mass you have, how tall you are, and how active you are. So if you only need 1,500 calories a day in order to maintain your current life, and you eat 1,900 calories a day, in a little while, you're going to gain a couple pounds. So it's really looking at meeting and not exceeding those. The other thing we look at in this definition is the community. A community has to encompass all aspects, and community can look really different. And as we get more into your chapters, you'll begin to see community can be your school community, community can be your home community, it can be your cultural community. I'm Italian, and so it could be that my identification with that. It can also be governmental, right? And so we have to think of community, and then we have to come up with ideas that will focus on different communities and different populations. Some good examples of this are fortification programs. Fortification, what that is when we add a nutrient to a food that was not already present or was not present in the same amount. Really good example of this is folate. So folic acid is a deficiency in folic acid causes spina bifida, and it's when your spine doesn't completely close and your spinal cord is exposed when you're born. In 1996, Clinton had changed the laws on fortification, and he began to fortify all grains in the United States with additional folate. We see very few cases of spina bifida now as a direct result of that 1996 change in law and the requirement to add additional folate. So now mothers who are expecting get a higher amount of folic acid in their diet as the result. And so that's a really good example of how fortification programs can expand past and look at a whole population, taking into account culture and a bunch of different other aspects in order to be preventative of disease. Okay. Also look at sanitation and nutrient deficiencies in infectious diseases. So we're not going to talk too much about infectious diseases because our primary focus in this course is that, that non-communicable. Okay, so also understanding that when we look at public health nutrition, it has to be full circle. And so we have to have a capable and qualified workforce that serves that population. If our health educators aren't trained in understanding communicable, non-communicable disease, then how do we expect them to lead? And so it's really important that public health realm, specifically nutrition, include all aspects of health educators and health proponents and health administrators. Okay, this slide is actually pretty important for you. You really do need to understand the difference between primary preventions, secondary preventions, and tertiary preventions. And so primary is an example, that grain fortification story I told you. So this is, we are trying to prevent primarily before the population has a chance to develop the disease. Okay. Secondary preventions really look at risk factor detection. And so, for example, a good example of this would be screening people for HPV. So a young girl going in and getting screened for HPV so she doesn't develop cervical cancer later. That would be a secondary prevention. So a primary prevention might be the vaccination for HPV. So that would be primary. A secondary would be a screening to see if HPV is present, because at the end we're really trying to prevent cancer from occurring. A tertiary prevention really is looking at, okay, this is already present. What can we do to mitigate or eliminate? Here, the example is of vitamin A, providing vitamin A to children with mild vitamin A deficiency. One of the wonderful things about GMOs, for example, is there's something called golden rice. And golden rice is a tertiary prevention, and it was created with beta carotene. Beta carotene is what your body converts to vitamin A. And so it is a very cheap and easy way to give underdeveloped nations large amounts of vitamin A to prevent blindness, which is what happens when you have a lack of vitamin A, in the food supply that will be healthy for them. And so it's called golden rice. And that's a great example of a tertiary prevention that will help with complications or prevent disease. Okay. We have to understand this all is a cooperative effort, right? And so the government has to be on board as much as the community has to be on board. And it also has to be accessible. We have to know our population. A really good example of this is there was a complete ad campaign to help prevent the spread of HIV in Africa. And what happened is they put up all these signs, and they worked with the government, and it was more World Health Organization rather than understanding really local government. And they put up a bunch of billboards that put women in power, and that women can say no, and women can request the use of condoms. Except in Africa, women are second-class citizens, and they do not have that kind of power. And so it was a real fail in understanding the accessibility to the information being provided, and what happens when you don't know the entirety of that population when the governments don't work together. So where that would have worked in the United States, empowering women to ask for the use of condoms and safe testing and all of that, very powerful in a place where women and men are equal, really irrelevant in a place where it's a graded society. So one of the things I want you to review, and I'm not going to go through them, you can read about them. I want you to read about the 10 essential public health services. Really, you should kind of know the core function when we look at public health and what falls into our preview. So ultimately, with nutrition and global health, overnutrition is our problem. We are just eating ourselves into the grave pretty much. And so largely in this class, we're really going to look at global burden of disease, the global burden of malnutrition, and where our focus is going to be malnutrition even when energy is available. A good example of this is we've started to see cases of scurvy in the South. Now, scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency, which can be met with fresh fruits and vegetables. Pretty much, you always think of like oranges, lemons, limes, bell peppers, all good sources. But in the South, they eat so much processed food, and there's a high poverty rate, and we have our highest obesity rates in the South, that people were eating absolutely no fresh food and started developing symptoms of scurvy. And so when we look at that double burden of malnutrition, we're not just thinking about the people who don't have access to food. We're talking about also poverty and the people who have access to food, but the food is so not nutrient dense that they're still getting sick. Right? And we're going to look at all these chronic diseases as they relate to food, because these are all directly related to food, which is why, for example, type 2 diabetes, how many, it's supposed to be 1 out of every 3 people now should be, if they don't have type 2 diabetes, will get type 2 diabetes. And this is a direct result of just behavior and nothing more. Okay. This is just a little slide so you can kind of take a look at different careers in public health. I think a lot of times people look at public health and they don't really know what you do in public health, or they think, oh my gosh, I just make policy in an office. No. You can work in clinical settings. You can work in private settings. You can focus on health promotion versus health policy. There's a lot of aspects now to public health, and public health is getting so much more attention because of that preventative notion, right? Go back to that side, preventative, secondary, and tertiary, right? So it's very important that we're focusing on all these areas to change the public's health. And here are just a little slide on some careers specifically around nutrition. I actually love teaching nutrition and working within nutrition. And so if this is something interesting to you, I just put it out there for you. And that is it. So our primary concerns in this class, and as we move forward, this is really what we're going to be looking at. And so hang on, it's going to be a great ride. And that was chapter 1.